The man's fingers wrapped around Grace's wrist before she could pull away. Not her ex-boyfriend. Not a stranger on the street. Her employer. David Cho, VP of Operations at Meridian Holdings, the man who had signed her performance reviews for 3 years, had his hand locked around her arm in the middle of the company gala in front of no fewer than 200 people. And he was squeezing. "You're going to smile," he said, his voice low and tight. "You're going to stand here, look beautiful, then stop pretending you have somewhere else to be tonight." The ballroom was all crystal and candlelight. The kind of room that cost more per hour than Grace made in a month. Women in gowns, men in tuxedos, servers gliding between them with champagne flutes that caught the light like small fires. And Grace, still in her catering uniform, her name badge slightly crooked, a smear of chocolate mousse on her left cuff, standing at the edge of the dessert station with a man's hand bruising her wrist. "Let go," she said quietly. "Lower your voice." David smiled at a passing couple without releasing her. The couple smiled back and kept walking. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked twice. That was the thing about this kind of room. Pain wore a smile here, and everyone was too polished to acknowledge it. "David." Her voice stayed steady, even though her chest was hammering. "I said let go. You don't get to make demands." His grip tightened. "You're a contractor. You're here because I approved your company's contract. You want that renewed, you'll stand here and take your hands off her." The voice came from somewhere to her left. Not loud, not angry. Careful. The way a man speaks when he has already decided the outcome and is simply giving you the option to arrive there without incident. Every head in a 10-foot radius turned. The 6 men in black suits who had been flanking him, bodyguards, unmistakably, the kind that cost more than this entire catering contract, stepped aside in perfect, silent unison. Not because their boss told them to make room, because they understood, without being told, that he was walking forward. He was Korean, broad-shouldered, dark suit, no tie, a presence that pressed against the air around him like weather. His name was Seo Jun. Grace didn't know that yet, but the room did. His eyes were fixed on David's hand. David's grip loosened. His face shifted. Confusion first, then something that crawled toward fear, but hadn't arrived there yet. "I'm sorry," David said, laughing the thin laugh of a man stalling. "Do I know you?" Seo Jun said nothing. He stopped 2 feet away, and the silence he brought with him was heavier than anything David had said. Grace's wrist slipped free. She didn't run. She didn't move. She just stood there, heart slamming, mousse on her sleeve, looking at this stranger who had walked through 6 bodyguards and 200 witnesses like none of them existed, and said 4 words that nobody in this room was going to forget. "Take your hands off her." And the thing that nobody would be able to explain later, not even the bodyguards, was why they stepped aside. He hadn't looked at them, hadn't gestured, hadn't spoken a single word in their direction. They just moved. David Cho had not moved. That was the problem. Most men, when faced with something they couldn't immediately categorize, chose retreat. David had chosen to stand his ground, which told Grace everything she needed to know about how this evening had been going to end, with or without the stranger in the dark suit. "I don't know who you think you are," David said. And his voice had found its footing again, climbing back toward authority. He straightened his jacket, looked Seo-jun up and down with the particular contempt of a man who had never once been told no by someone he couldn't fire. "But this is a private event, and whatever you think you just saw, I know what I saw." 4 words. Quiet. Final. David blinked. Around them, the ballroom had not resumed, and the music was still playing. Something soft and orchestral that now felt obscene against the tension knotting the air. But the conversations nearest to them had gone silent. Guests stood with champagne flutes raised halfway to their mouths, frozen mid-gesture, watching. 200 people, and not one of them moved to help her. Seo-jun didn't look at them. He looked only at David, and there was nothing in his expression that resembled anger. It was colder than anger, more deliberate. The face of a man who had already run the calculation and arrived at the answer before the problem had finished presenting itself. "She works for your company." David tried again, his voice dropping to a register meant to suggest reason, negotiation, the language of men sorting out a misunderstanding. "This is an internal matter. I'd suggest you... She doesn't work for you anymore." David laughed, short and sharp. "Excuse me?" Seo-jun reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. He held it out to David without ceremony, the way you hand someone a receipt. David took it slowly, the way you take something when you already suspect it's going to ruin your evening. He unfolded it. His eyes moved across the page. Grace watched his face change, the color draining from his cheeks in stages, like water leaving a bathtub. "That," Seo-jun said, "is the service contract between Meridian Holdings and Carter Catering. As of 40 minutes ago, it has been purchased and reassigned. She reports to no one at this company. Not tonight, not again." Grace heard the words. She understood them individually. Together, they refused to arrange themselves into anything that made sense. "You can't just..." David started. "I already did." The document crumpled slightly in David's grip. His jaw worked. He looked from the paper to Seo-jun to Grace. And in that sequence of looks, Grace saw the precise moment a man realizes the room he thought he owned has changed hands without his permission. One of Seo-jun's bodyguards appeared at David's left elbow. Silent, enormous, expression professionally blank. David looked at him, then back at Seo-jun. Then he straightened his jacket again, a gesture that had stopped meaning anything, and walked away. Grace watched him go. She watched him disappear into the crowd, watched the guests part for him and close behind him like water. And she felt something strange move through her chest, not relief exactly. Something rawer than that. Something that had been wound very tight for a very long time, and had just, without warning, been allowed to loosen a single notch. She turned to Seo-jun. He was already looking at her. His expression had shifted. Not soft, not exactly. But the cold calculation had receded to somewhere behind his eyes, and what remained was quieter. More human. He looked at her wrist. Without asking, without announcing his intention, he reached out and turned her hand gently palm up. The red marks David's fingers had left were already beginning to purple at the edges. Seo Jun looked at them for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked up at her. "Are you alone tonight?" he asked. Grace lifted her chin. "I was managing." "I know," he said. "That's not what I asked." 3 weeks earlier, Grace had been standing in a different kind of room. Smaller, fluorescent lit, the kind of office that smelled like recycled air and quiet desperation. A lone officer's desk at First Meridian Bank, with a plastic plant in the corner that hadn't been watered since 2019 and a motivational poster on the wall that said, "Your future starts today," in a font that had never once motivated anyone. Grace had sat across from the lone officer with her hands folded in her lap, and her business plan printed in a neat 12-page packet, and her smile fixed in place the way you fix a smile when everything depends on the next 5 minutes going correctly. The lone officer had not looked at the packet. "Miss Carter." He'd laced his fingers together on the desk. "Carter and Cumber Catering has been operating for 2 years. Your revenue last quarter was $18,400. Your outstanding debt, between the commercial kitchen lease, the equipment financing, and the SBA microloan you took in year 1, totals $47,000. We can't extend additional credit at this time." Grace had kept smiling. "The contract I'm applying against," she said carefully, "is worth $240,000 over 18 months. Meridian Holdings. It's already been verbally confirmed. I just need the bridge financing to hire 2 additional staff and purchase the cold storage unit. Without a signed contract in hand, we can't treat that as collateral. I can have the signed contract within the week. Then come back with the signed contract." She had come back with the signed contract, and that was where it had gone wrong. The contract that David Cho placed in front of her was not the contract they had discussed. The payment terms had shifted. Net 90 instead of net 30. Which meant Grace would complete 3 months of work before seeing a single dollar. The exclusivity clause buried on page 7 meant she couldn't take any other corporate clients for the duration of the agreement. And the renewal option, which she had been told was automatic, now required David's personal written approval. Her lawyer, a college friend named Simone who did contracts part-time, had flagged all 3 clauses on a Tuesday afternoon phone call, her voice careful and measured in the way people get when they are telling you something is wrong, but don't want to be the one who talked you out of saving yourself. "Grace, this gives him a lot of leverage over you." "I know. The net 90 terms alone could put you under if he's slow to approve invoices." "I know," hung Simone. A pause. "So, what are you going to do?" Grace had looked at the stack of bills on her kitchen counter. The kitchen lease renewal notice sitting on top, 30 days overdue. The text from her mother, "Just checking in, baby. Hope the business is treating you right." Which was her gentle way of asking if Grace still needed help covering her car note this month, because Grace had asked her to cover it last month and the month before that. She had looked at her business plan. 12 pages. Printed and reprinted again over 2 years of 4 a.m. mornings and weekends she hadn't taken. And events she'd catered alone when her staff called in sick because she couldn't afford to lose a single booking. "I'm going to sign it," Grace said. Grace. "I'm going to sign it, and I'm going to deliver work so good he has no reason to use those clauses. And in 18 months, I'm going to have $240,000 in contracts, enough leverage to renegotiate from a position of strength. Simone had been quiet for a long moment. Okay, she said finally. I hear you. What neither of them had said, what Grace had known and pushed to the very back of her mind and locked there, was that David Cho had been looking at her differently since the third meeting. That his comments had started landing slightly off-center. That the way he'd said you'd be a real asset to our events had not been entirely about her cooking. She had told herself she was being paranoid. She had told herself she could manage it. She had been managing it for 3 weeks, smiling at his jokes, redirecting his comments, Nick staying near other staff when she felt the room shift, right up until tonight, when his hand had closed around her wrist in a room full of 200 people who had all looked away. She had been managing it, right up until the moment she didn't have to anymore. The car was a Rolls-Royce Ghost. Grace knew this because the man who had opened the door for her, dark suit, earpiece, expression carved from something harder than politeness, had said nothing at all. And somehow the silence felt appropriate for a car that cost more than her entire catering contract. She slid in. The leather was the color of cream, and so soft it felt almost wrong to sit on it. The cabin smelled like cedar and something darker underneath. Sandalwood, maybe, or black amber. And the partition between them and the driver was already raised, sealing them inside a quiet so complete Grace could hear her own breathing. Seo Jun sat beside her. Not close. He'd left a deliberate distance between them, the width of a full seat cushion, and he was looking out the window at the Seoul financial district sliding past in ribbons of light. He had said nothing since they left the ballroom. Neither had she. Grace had told herself she would speak first, that she would be composed and direct and ask the exact questions that needed asking. She was a business owner. She had negotiated contracts. She had managed rooms full of people who underestimated her for her entire professional life. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs to stop them from shaking. I'm not going wherever you're taking me, she said. Seo Jun turned from the window. His expression hadn't changed. All right, he said. She blinked. All right? Tell me where you want to go and the driver will take you there. Grace opened her mouth, closed it. The honest answer, her apartment, 20 minutes away, where her lease renewal was 30 days overdue, and the refrigerator held half a container of leftover rice, and the specific silence of a woman who had been holding everything together alone for so long. She'd forgotten what it felt like not to. Was not an answer she was willing to give this man. I don't need your help, she said instead. You needed it 40 minutes ago. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even pointed. It was simply accurate, delivered in the same tone he might use to read a weather report. And somehow that made it worse. Grace looked away. The car had begun to slow. Through the window, she could see a building rising above the surrounding city, glass and black steel, the kind of architecture that didn't bother announcing itself because it didn't need to. A doorman in a charcoal uniform stood at the entrance. 2 more men flanked the lobby doors, hands clasped, watching the car arrive. I'm not staying with you, Grace said. There are 4 guest suites, Seo Jun said, each with its own entrance. Mrs. Yoon, my housekeeper, will be there. You won't see me unless you choose to. That's not... Grace stopped. steadied herself. Why are you doing this? You bought my contract, you walked into that ballroom, you... She turned to face him fully. What do you want from me, Seo-jun? He looked at her for a long moment. The city light moved across his face in slow intervals. Bright, then dark, then bright again. Nothing, he said. People don't do what you did tonight for nothing. No, he agreed. They don't. He didn't elaborate. He simply held her gaze with an openness that was more unsettling than any deflection could have been. And Grace felt something shift in the room, some small tectonic thing, deep and slow, the kind of movement you don't notice until the ground has already changed beneath you. The car stopped. Mrs. Yoon was waiting in the lobby. A small Korean woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned neatly and reading glasses hanging from a chain at her chest. She bowed slightly when Grace stepped out of the car, her expression warm and unhurried, as if women arrived here at midnight in catering uniforms all the time, and it was simply never a problem. Miss Grace, she said, I've drawn a bath. There's food if you're hungry. Clothes have been set out. I guessed your size, but I am usually right. Grace turned to look at Seo-jun. He was already stepping back toward the car. You're not coming in? She asked before she could stop herself. He paused with one hand on the door. Something moved across his face, brief and unguarded, gone before she could name it. I have things to take care of, he said quietly. The door closed. The car pulled away, and Grace stood in the lobby of the most expensive building she had ever entered, in a chocolate mousse-stained catering uniform, next to a housekeeper who was already guiding her gently toward the elevator, and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, like she could breathe. She didn't know what that meant yet. She was afraid she was starting to. She had been there 4 days when David called. Not her work number. Her personal cell, the one she hadn't given him, the one that wasn't on any Meridian Holdings paperwork, the one only people she actually trusted had access to. Grace stared at his name on the screen for 3 full rings. Then she answered. I want to be very clear, David said, skipping hello entirely, his voice carrying the particular tight energy of a man who had spent 4 days constructing an argument he believed in. What happened at the gala was a misunderstanding. I'd had too much to drink. I was out of line, and I recognized that. But what that man did, whoever he is, interfering in a private business arrangement, pulling my contract without notice. My contract, Grace said. A beat of silence. Excuse me? You said your contract. Grace was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of the guest suite, 42 floors above the city, watching the morning move across the skyline in slow gold increments. Her coffee was hot in her hand. Her voice was steady. It was never your contract, David. It was mine. I built it. I delivered it. You just held the signature. Grace. His tone shifted. Softer now, recalibrating toward reason. I understand you're upset. That's fair. But you need to think about this practically. That contract was your lifeline. Without Meridian Holdings, you're back to $47,000 in debt with no pipeline. And now I've already spoken to legal, and there are grounds to challenge the reassignment. There aren't. The voice came from behind her. Grace turned. Seo-jun was standing in the doorway of the suite. Not inside it, she noticed, precisely on the threshold, as if he'd been raised with an understanding of which lines required permission to cross. He was in a white dress shirt, no jacket, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked, she thought despite herself, like he hadn't slept and was completely unbothered by it. He held out his hand. She hesitated 1 second. Then she put the phone in it. "Mr. Cho." Seo Jun's voice was pleasant, conversational. The tone of a man discussing something mildly interesting over lunch. "I've reviewed the original service agreement, the verbal confirmation emails from your assistant dated the 14th, and the amended contract you presented Ms. Carter. I've also reviewed your company's HR records." A pause. All of them. Silence on the line. "The reassignment is airtight," Seo Jun continued. "My legal team filed the paperwork with 3 separate confirmations. If you instruct your attorneys to challenge it, that process will take approximately 14 months. During that time, the records I mentioned will become relevant. I imagine your board will find them interesting." The silence on the line had a different quality now. Heavier. The silence of a man doing rapid, desperate arithmetic. "If you contact Ms. Carter again," Seo Jun said, "on any number, through any channel, directly or through a third party, those records stop being private. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" A long pause. "Yes," David said. The word came out stripped of everything. No authority, no negotiation, no carefully constructed argument. Just a single syllable from a man who had just watched every card in his hand disappear. Seo Jun ended the call. He set the phone on the console table just inside the door and looked at Grace. She realized her jaw was tight. She unclenched it deliberately. "What records?" she asked. "Complaints," he said simply. 4 of them, filed internally over the last 2 years, all buried. Grace felt something move through her, hot and clarifying, burning away the last residue of the doubt she'd been carrying, the quiet wondering if she'd misread the situation, if she'd been too sensitive, if she'd imagined the way his eyes had tracked her across every room. She hadn't imagined anything. She had known. She had always known. She had just been $47,000 in debt and out of options. Before we find out what happens next, if this story has you gripped, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell. Because what Seo Jun does in the next 24 hours, nobody sees it coming, not even Grace. Seo Jun was already stepping back from the threshold. "Breakfast is ready," he said. "Mrs. Yoon made it. She'll be offended if it gets cold." He turned to leave. "Seo Jun." He stopped, didn't turn around. "Thank you," Grace said. A pause, just long enough to mean something. "Don't thank me yet," he said quietly. And then he was gone. She heard him come in at 1:47 a.m. She knew the time because she hadn't been sleeping. She'd been sitting at the kitchen island in the oversized guest robe Mrs. Yoon had left folded on the bathroom counter, working through the revised business plan she'd started rebuilding from scratch. New projections, new client targets, a pipeline that didn't have David Cho's name anywhere in it. And the numbers had been cooperating just well enough to keep her at the table past midnight. She heard the elevator. Then the main door. Then nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Just a stillness that felt different from the usual stillness of the apartment. Heavier somehow, the way the air changes when someone is standing very quietly inside it. Grace set down her pen. She found him in the living room. He was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window. The same window she stood at every morning with her coffee, watching the city. Still in his suit, jacket on. But his tie was pulled loose and hanging open, and his right hand was pressed flat against the glass, like he needed something solid to push against. He hadn't heard her come in. She watched him for a moment. The city spread out behind the glass, 42 floors below, all light and distance. And Seo-jun stood against it, like a man who owned everything he could see, and found no comfort in any of it. "You don't have to pretend I'm not here," Grace said quietly. He turned. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, more like a man who had forgotten, briefly, that the world still contained other people. "I didn't want to wake you," he said. "I wasn't sleeping." He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the window. Grace crossed the room and stood beside him, not close, leaving the same deliberate distance he always left for her, and looked out at the city. "Bad night?" she asked. A long pause. "There are parts of my life," Seo-jun said carefully, "that require things I don't enjoy requiring." He was quiet for a moment. "Tonight reminded me of that." Grace didn't push. She had learned, in 6 days of living inside the architecture of his silences, that Seo-jun didn't respond to pressure. He responded to space. She gave him space. He spoke anyway. "I made a decision 12 years ago," he said. "I told myself it was practical, that the world I was entering had its own rules and I would follow them, and it wouldn't cost me anything I wasn't willing to pay." His jaw tightened slightly. "I was 23. I didn't know yet what the payments looked like." Grace looked at his reflection in the glass. His eyes were already on hers. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Some nights," he said. "Not the decision. The cost." The city hummed 42 floors below them. Somewhere distant, a siren rose and faded. Grace became aware, in the slow and specific way you become aware of things at 1:47 a.m. in a quiet room, that she had shifted slightly closer to him without meaning to. That the distance between them had narrowed to something that was no longer deliberate. That Seo-jun had not moved away. He turned from the window to face her. His eyes dropped, just once, just briefly, to her mouth. Then back up. The air in the room did something Grace had no clinical term for. "Grace," he said. His voice was low and careful, the same voice he used when he was choosing his words with full awareness of their weight. "I know," she said softly. Because she did know. She knew exactly what this was, and exactly why it couldn't move forward, and exactly how little that logic was helping her at this particular moment. Seo-jun reached up slowly. His hand cupped her face, just barely, just his fingertips against her jaw. And he looked at her with something open and unguarded that she had never seen on him before. Something that looked, she thought, almost like longing. Then he dropped his hand, stepped back. "I should go," he said. "I have things to take care of." He was halfway down the hallway before Grace remembered how to breathe. She turned back to the window. The city looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago. She had never in her life resented a skyline so much. She found it by accident. Now that was the thing she would keep coming back to later. She hadn't been looking. She hadn't gone searching through his things or his life, or the carefully maintained distance he kept between who he was in this apartment and who he was everywhere else. She had simply been trying to find a pen. Mrs. Yoon had asked her to sign for a delivery. Grace had gone to the console table in the main hallway, the same one Seo Jun had set her phone on the morning of David's call. And she had pulled open the narrow drawer, looking for something to write with. Inside was a single photograph. She almost didn't pick it up. But something about it snagged her attention, the quality of it. Too sharp and too deliberate to be casual, the kind of image someone takes when they are documenting rather than remembering. It was a man. Korean, mid-50s, seated at a restaurant table. Across from him sat two other men Grace didn't recognize. On the table between them was an open briefcase. In the corner of the photograph, handwritten in red ink, were 8 digits that looked like a financial routing number. And below that, 2 words in English. He already moved. Grace put the photograph back. She closed the drawer. She signed for the delivery with Mrs. Yoon's pen from her apron pocket and said nothing. That afternoon, she found Mrs. Yoon in the kitchen folding linen napkins with the focused precision of a woman who had worked in this household long enough to have developed opinions about the correct angle of a fold. Grace sat at the island. "Mrs. Yoon," she said carefully, "how long have you worked for Seo Jun?" Mrs. Yoon didn't look up from the napkins. 11 years, she said. "And before this apartment?" "The house in Hanamdong." A pause. "And before that, his father's house." Grace let that settle. "His father," she said. "What did his father do?" Mrs. Yoon's hands stilled on the linen, just for a moment, barely a full second, before resuming their precise, unpracticed folding. "Mr. Kwon Sr., she said carefully, was a very powerful man." "And Seo Jun?" Mrs. Yoon set the folded napkin down. She looked at Grace for the first time since the conversation had started, and her expression held something that was not quite a warning and not quite sadness, but lived in the territory between them. "He is a good man," Mrs. Yoon said. "I want you to understand that first. Whatever else I say, that is the foundation. He is a good man operating inside a world that was built before he was old enough to choose it." Grace held her gaze. "But," a long pause. "But goodness," Mrs. Yoon said quietly, "does not always protect the people standing closest to it." She picked up the next napkin. The conversation, Grace understood, was over. She was still at the island an hour later when Seo Jun came home. He stopped when he saw her face. He was good at reading rooms. She had noticed this about him, the way he walked into a space and immediately understood its emotional weather. He read her now in exactly the same way, and she watched something shift behind his eyes. He set his keys on the counter. He didn't speak, neither did she. The photograph sat in the drawer 20 feet down the hallway. The 8 digits, the 2 words, already moved. The briefcase open on the restaurant table and the 3 men who knew what was inside it. Grace looked at Seo Jun. He looked back at her. And in the silence between them lived everything she now knew and hadn't said. And everything he understood she knew and hadn't explained, in the precise and terrible distance between a man who wanted to protect someone and a world that made that protection complicated. "Dinner is ready," Mrs. Yoon called from the kitchen. Seo Jun's eyes didn't leave Grace's. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Grace thought about the photograph, about Mrs. Yoon's hand stilling on the linen, about a good man operating inside a world built before he was old enough to choose it. "Ask me again tomorrow," she said. And she walked to the dining room without looking back. The invitation arrived on a Thursday. Meridian Holdings' annual stakeholder dinner. Black tie. The kind of event that existed to remind everyone in the room of the exact order of things. Who sat at which table, who gave the toast, who auctioned the centerpiece for charity, and whose name went on the plaque. Grace stared at it for a long time. It had been forwarded to her new business address. Carter & Co. Catering, now operating under a restructured contract worth $310,000 over 24 months, reassigned by Seo Jun's legal team to 3 separate corporate clients who had never once asked her to smile in a way that made her skin crawl. She didn't know why she had been invited. She went anyway. The ballroom was the same one. Same crystal chandeliers throwing the same fractured light across the same marble floors. Same orchestra playing the same soft, expensive music that was designed to make people feel like nothing bad could happen here. Grace walked in alone. She was wearing a dress the color of deep emerald, her own, unbought with the first payment from the new contracts. And her back was straight, and her hands were steady, and she had decided in the elevator on the way up that she was not going to feel small in this room. Not tonight. Not ever again in a room like this. She saw David Cho before he saw her. He was standing near the bar, holding court with 3 men in tuxedos, his face carrying the practiced ease of someone who had convinced himself the worst was behind him. He looked, Grace thought, exactly like a man who believed he had gotten away with something. He hadn't. She knew this because 40 minutes earlier, in the back of Seo Jun's car on the way to the venue, Seo Jun had handed her a tablet without preamble. On the screen was an email thread between David Cho and Meridian Holdings' head of HR, dated 14 months ago. In it, and David had explicitly requested that 2 of the 4 internal complaints filed against him be reclassified as, his words, personality conflicts requiring no further action. Below the email thread was a second document, a formal submission to the Meridian Holdings Board of Directors, filed that morning by Seo Jun's legal team, CC'd to 3 members of the company's audit committee and 1 investigative journalist at the Korea Jungang Daily. Grace had looked up from the tablet. "You've had this for weeks," she said. "Yes." "Why tonight?" Seo Jun had looked at her steadily. "Because you deserved to be in the room when it landed." It landed at 8:47 p.m. She watched it happen from across the ballroom. Watched the Meridian Holdings CEO excuse himself from a conversation. He watched him cross the room to David with his phone in his hand and his expression stripped of all its careful social polish. Watched David's face as he read whatever was on that screen. The color left him in stages, just like it had in the contract hallway. Just like it had the night Seo Jun handed him that document and watched him crumble into a single quiet syllable. David looked up from the phone. His eyes found Grace across the ballroom. She didn't look away. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Calm, direct, unblinking. And then she turned her back on him and walked toward the exit. She didn't run. She didn't rush. She walked the way a woman walks when she has nothing left to prove to a room. Seo Jun was waiting outside on the steps. No bodyguards. No car yet. Just him. Jacket on. Hands in his pockets. Looking out at the city the way he looked at things when he was actually seeing them. He turned when he heard her heels on the marble steps. She stopped in front of him. "You didn't have to come tonight," he said. "I know," Grace said. "That's why I did." She reached out and straightened his lapel, a small, deliberate gesture, unhurried and sure. And Seo Jun went very still beneath her hand, the way he went still when something mattered more than he had prepared for. She looked up at him. "Ask me if I'm all right," she said quietly. Something shifted in his eyes, warm and slow and certain. "Are you all right?" he asked. Grace smiled, the first real smile in a very long time, the kind that starts somewhere deep and arrives on your face without asking permission. "Yes," she said, finally. He offered his hand. She took it, and they walked down the steps together into the city, leaving the ballroom and David Cho and $47,000 worth of fear behind them. And Grace didn't look back once, not even to watch it disappear. Before you click away, let's talk about what Grace's story just showed us. Because this wasn't just a love story. It was a mirror. Grace Carter walked into a contract she knew felt wrong. She spotted every red flag. She felt every warning in her gut. But she signed anyway. Because $47,000 in debt has a way of making dangerous doors look like the only doors available. And that is the first lesson. Desperation is not stupidity, but it is dangerous. When your back is against the wall financially, you don't lose your intelligence. You lose your negotiating power. And there are people in every industry, in every boardroom, in every gala ballroom who are specifically watching for the moment your options run out. Because that is when they move. So here is what Grace's story is actually teaching you. Number 1. Your gut is a contract clause. Grace knew. She knew in the third meeting when David's eyes tracked her across the room. She knew when the payment terms shifted to net 90. She knew when the exclusivity clause appeared on page 7. Her instincts filed a complaint long before any HR department did. Learn to treat that discomfort as data. Write it down. Date it. Keep the record. Because silence feels like survival in the moment and becomes someone else's weapon later. Number 2, urgency is a manipulation tactic. No legitimate opportunity disappears because you took 72 hours to think. The pressure David applied, the implied threat of losing the contract, the suggestion that Grace was lucky to have it at all, was engineered. It was designed to shrink her options in her own mind before she had finished reading the document in front of her. Whenever someone needs your signature right now, that is precisely when you slow down. Number 3. The cage was never the $47,000. This is the one that matters most. Grace spent 3 weeks believing the debt was the thing trapping her. It wasn't. The trap was the belief that she had no other choice. That belief, not the money, not the contract, but not David Cho, was what kept her standing at that dessert station, smiling at jokes that made her skin crawl. The moment she stopped managing the situation and started naming it, everything changed. Not because Seo Jun arrived, because she arrived. He just made sure the room was safe enough for her to do it. And number 4, you are never so behind that you owe someone your dignity. Not your employer, not your landlord, not the person holding the contract you need to survive the next 90 days. Your dignity is not a negotiating chip. The moment someone treats it like one, that is your exit cue. Take it, even when it's terrifying, especially then. Grace walked into that final ballroom alone, in her own dress, bought with her own money. She didn't go back to confront David. She didn't go back to perform her healing for an audience. She went back because she refused to let that room be the last memory she had of herself in it. That is what a crown moment actually looks like. Not the chandelier, not the emerald dress, not even Seo Jun waiting on the steps. It looks like a woman who decided, quietly, completely, without asking anyone's permission, that she was done being managed. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in Grace's journey hit a little too close to home, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe and click the video on your screen right now, because every story we tell here carries something real underneath it. Drop a comment below. Tell me, what was the moment Grace changed for you? Was it when she said, "My contract"? Was it when she walked into that ballroom alone? Or was it the very beginning, when she didn't chase the man who let her go? Wherever you're watching from, you found this for a reason. See you in the next one.